Hello, everyone. This is Katrina Menzigian with Everest Group, and wanted to kick off our session here for our analyst relations community out there. I'm a vice president with Everest Group, and I lead our analyst relations engagement program, which is basically designed to make sure that Everest Group is working effectively with the analyst relations community, and that we're driving value in our interactions with you, and that you feel the same in your engagement with Everest Group. I'm super excited to be joined today by a few colleagues, David Ricard and Nitish Mittal. David and Nitish are both actually in the London area, so they've tolerated a lot of heat lately and things seem to be getting better. But David is a VP with our CXM and our sourcing vendor program, and Nitish is a partner with our ITS program. David, Nitish, over to you guys for some quick words.
Thanks, Katrina. Yeah, hi everyone. So, really looking forward to talking about the RFI process here today. I've been with Everest Group about 18 months and I've covered a number of peak processes, so really interested in engaging with you on this.
Great. And Nitish?
Perfect. Thanks, Katrina. First of all, thanks for having me and organizing this platform. And hi, folks. My name is Nitish, partner with the firm. I lead our focus on IT and digital services topics with a more specific focus on Europe and UKI. So happy to share, what I've been observing at Everest Group and all the fun stuff around our peak matrix and the RFI process.
Okay, great. So we have folks that have registered from all over the world. So if you're here and you're on, please, let us know where you're from. And I really liked something I heard the other day, given all the heat wave that's going on everywhere in the world. Are you having a hot day or a cool day? And what does the temperature look like where you are? If you want to throw that in with your city and your weather situation, that would be helpful. So today's session is really designed to help put some color behind the RFI process at Everest Group. And all of you as analyst relations professionals know that research RFI processes are, super necessary, but can be also a big investment of time and effort and thought for yourselves as well as for the research firm that you're working with. At Everest Group, we have recently gone through an entire redesign of our RFI process, and we've tried to make it as streamlined and as intuitive, really, and user-friendly as possible. So I'll be talking more about that. But we also hear a lot of questions about things that have to do specifically with the Everest Group RFI, and wanted to make sure that we kind of give you some of that color as well today, because we appreciate the time and effort you put in, and we want to make sure that you feel that you've got your questions answered. But I love the fact we've got folks from Warwick, Rhode Island, Princeton, New Jersey, Guatemala, sunny, nice, New Jersey, Belfast. Oh, Belfast is actually kind of nice right now. It feels like I'd like to be there a little bit and cool off. Here in Boston, it's already 84 and it's about 9:30 in the morning. 84 Fahrenheit, obviously. But we've got a lot going ahead of us here. Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone. So let me take you through a couple of key things that I wanted to share with you folks today. One of them is, things that you've wondered, things that we hear about. I've worked many years as an analyst, as well as Nitish and David, so we are familiar with these questions and wanted to kind of put them out there and have an open conversation. One of the things we hear about often is, how does Everest Group use all this information that they gather? We're asked, you have such a detailed RFI, what do you do with this information? Why do you ask information that's not on the peak matrix? So let me answer that for you. First of all, yes, RFIs are often directly manifested into a peak matrix assessment. So that's clear. Now, what do we do with the breadth of that data? So for one thing, keep in mind that the data you provide us, it's about your company, but it's also about what's going on in the market. And we want you to get value out of the research that we produce using that RFI, right? So think about it that way. It's not just to produce a particular report, but it's to produce the depth of analysis that we're capable of delivering back to you. as well as to our enterprise clients. So what is the data from the RFI used for? First and foremost, we do receive inquiries from buyers or enterprise clients about different kinds of sourcing decisions they're trying to make. So the RFIs, while we provide information anonymously, depending on the question and the circumstance, we may also provide it on an aggregated basis, or we may provide it in the form of short lists of potential providers that need to be on a client's short list of considerations. So knowing that we have in-depth data allows us to do a better job of putting out useful information for those buyers. We also conduct various types of studies. So we have our state of the market studies, we have our service provider landscape studies. And so, that all comes out of those RFIs that you help us complete. And then the thematic reports, what's going on with digital adoption in the particular vertical industry? What's going on with trends in CXM having to do with new offerings that clients are looking for? And how is that changing in terms of the frequency of that demand for that kind of capability? All of that comes out of our ability to analyze rich data. And the other one that kind of is a key one is questions about data privacy and protection. So our data is really retained strictly by the team working in that market area. So I'm familiar with the CXM market and I helped manage a number of different BPS markets. But if I was not a direct contributor to research in a particular market, I had no access to that data. That data set sits with the team working on that particular study, and you will know who that is. So we have a lot of careful management of who has access to which sets of data, even within our own research teams, never mind across the company and across different parts of the organization. So I wanted to put that out there because I know a lot of people are concerned about their, when they hand the data over, who gets to see it and how is it used. Nitish, I wanted to ask you to talk about the team approach to RFIs and the fact of how do we manage the process of the RFI so that you've got different people with different roles on the team?
Yep, I think, Katrina, that's a great question and something that comes up often from AR professionals, but also other leaders that we engage with. And I think it's key to the way we function as a team. I think the way we want to do this is Everest Group doesn't have the rock star analyst approach, unlike some of our peers, which means that we just don't have one person or a few selected individuals which track a market. Fun fact, we have about 400 odd analysts now globally. We're going to touch 500 at some point this year. So what we try and do is we create a full stack team across different levels of experience and backgrounds to be able to work on a project. So what that essentially means is, for any given peak matrix, yes, you might have 2 or 3 specific analysts that a provider might be more familiar with or who they see as faces of that assessment. But more often than not, for some of these complex areas, we have 4 or 5 analysts working together, and some of them can be senior analysts, you'll have practice directors, you have VPs, and you also have partners lending their support. So in some ways, what we want to do is make sure that we are creating a broader cohort of people who are working on this, but we also bring in fresh insight with people with different kinds of backgrounds. So one is tenure, but the background is also important, because when we hire, and if you look at analysts at Everest Group, they come from a range of different backgrounds. So we want to make sure we hire people with industry practitioner experience. David can talk about a lot of his work around how he helped make decisions in CXM outsourcing. At the same time, we also want to bring in more analytical and research rigor. So we hire people with consulting, research, and other professional services backgrounds. So it's the ability for us to make sure that we connect the dots, but also create more capability in teams that allows us to work in this slightly different model, which brings in a lot more richness and depth in my perspective.
Yeah, and David, as you're working on CXM studies, do you find that, I remember working on different studies where we would actually have a team-wide debate, and you had different people with different perspectives on the market debating, let's say, not the elements of the RFI per se, but as you work on a peak, the positioning on the peak and the importance of different criteria. Can you share some of that experience?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, we definitely do, because I think it's important that, because as Nitish said, we bring people from different perspectives. We're able to sort of challenge to say, okay, maybe in the past we've taken that criteria as being one of the most important, but actually with the market moving, different things are changing. Since I've come on board, and my background, I was a buyer of services for many years in a large enterprise. So I sometimes bring up, well, what does a buyer care about perspective, and does that change the way that we want to be looking at this? So it's definitely really important to make sure that we keep up to date with what's happening in the market, and actually what the industry is looking for and the buyers are looking for, so we can represent the peaks to match that. One thing I just wanted to say earlier as well, a comment you made earlier about sort of the importance of the RFIs. One of the areas I also work on, as you said, is sourcing and vendor management. And we get a lot of questions from sourcing professionals around, well, which providers have got footprint in these locations, etc. We get a lot of questions around that these days. So the information that we get through these RFIs is vital for us to be able to say, here's a list of 5 providers that are in those locations. And it's really important that we can showcase capabilities of providers in that way. So we're not ranking them or favouring anyone above the other, but just providing actual raw data to the people asking the question about who's in the market. So that's one of the other reasons. But yeah, go back to your original question, definitely important that we do bring different perspectives in, and we keep evolving how we do this to make sure we're representing the market demands as much as we can.
Yeah, good. And please, if you have questions about any of this, feel free to throw it into the comment section. We're monitoring that, and we'll be happy to build it into the conversation. And so the big question is, why should any of you care about all of the mechanics of how Everest Group does an RFI? There's some obvious things, right? We want to be able to provide very data-driven guidance. I mean, sure, we go to conferences and we follow general conversation in the marketplace, but that is not the source of the feedback that you will hear when we're putting out a conviction or an opinion or a data set or something like that. We go back to our RFI data sets and the databases that come from that on a daily and hourly basis sometimes. We are able to provide more detailed guidance to enterprise clients that seek input. And David started talking about that. Today, as we have this environment where there's military conflict in a part of the world where there's a lot of delivery happening, we're able to go into our data sets and from a city to city, location to location basis on a given process, be able to comment and provide guidance on, if you move things out of Prague, can you move them into Bucharest? And if what's the capability of the centers there, and how many providers are there, and what kind of skill sets are delivered out of those locations? And then if that's not a viable option, do we then look at Belfast for something? It's that depth that allows us to provide useful information. And some of these data sets have been in play and have been growing for over 10 years, 15 years in some cases. And so you can really see things happening over time and comparing markets, evolution and buyer demand and technology use and all of that over time. So that's another element of why we think analyst relations people should care, because hopefully it's useful to your organization in guiding your decision makers in your operations, but also it hopefully gives you confidence that if they're getting this input from an Everest Group source, that you can have a sense of confidence in the credibility of the guidance that they're working off of. David, let me ask you again about this, because you were, as you mentioned, a buyer of contact center services in a large multinational company. How did you think about the different information sources that you had to make those decisions?
Yes, so I think that what we looked at is we always looked at, well, where do you get the most detailed information from? What's the one that's most current, up to date? What's the most comprehensive? So we looked at number of sources, competitors to Everest Group. And I'll be honest, I was a customer of Everest Group, and so I found that the data we provided to be the most up to date, the most current, and the most comprehensive. But it was important to me that actually it was based on reality and actually based on a comprehensive RFI versus it being some subjective view of a provider's capabilities. And so I think for buyers in the audience or buyers out there in the market, you look at where am I going to get my data from, and is that data backed up with comprehensive research and comprehensive data that's coming directly from the providers, and not just someone saying, oh, that provider's got capabilities in these locations. So I think it's vital that you can attribute the data back to the source as well, but it's got to be comprehensive, and it's also got to be as up to date as possible.
Great, thank you. So let's move on a little bit. What are some of the common challenges or questions we hear? These are ones that we've put together. If you have questions, feel free to throw them into the comments. We'll switch over to those and move on from these. But Nitish, you were going to kind of talk about maybe a couple of key ones near the top here.
Absolutely. And Katrina, while I do that, I think I see a few questions coming in, which is nicely linked to your last point around longitudinal data, historical data, as well as predicting what we're seeing, right? So to answer this question, I think there are 2 or 3 ways in which we think about this. One, I think while I'm a great believer and a student of history, history can only teach you as much, right? So while we take care and take into account historical data, we want to make sure that we are figuring out the right triggers from a future forward-looking perspective. And the way we do it is, it's not just the nature of our teams, but the kind of analytical tools we're using. For instance, a lot of what we're now started doing is picking up sentiment analysis based on quarterly earnings, other signals in the market, looking at stock price movements, and upcoming RFPs in the market. So one is the strength of our historical data is important, but as we forecast, we want to make sure that we look into newer sources of information, revise our methodologies, to be able to do that. The second thing, which is more important, is I don't think we want to have rock solid or stale assumptions. We're always challenging our teams. So what are the things that we have considered? To David's point, maybe this is the way we have done a certain assessment before, but is this the best way to do it going forward, given the reality has changed? All of us can agree that we can't assess application development in the same way. We'll have to assess metaverse at some point. So the peak matrix methodologies, while they are consistent, there is enough room for innovation to be able to think into and take into account forward-looking innovation. So I hope I answered that question, but I think it's important to understand that while we, as analysts, we want to know and we want to pretend that we have all the answers, sometimes we don't. So being open to that innovation helps us predict what's going to come across as well.
And then just one other thing to add to that. Sorry. I think also is that one of the things that, as you said, like the RFI gives us a look back, but doesn't predict the future. But I think sometimes the briefings and the discussions and the relationships that we build up with the providers and the AR folks, it's also important to understand, well, what is the focus of that provider in the future? Where are they making investments? Where are they partnering? Because that also gives us insights into where they're going. So the RFI can only give us so much looking back. It's not saying where you're going to be in the future, because things can change, but some of the strategy that the providers are implementing give us a good opportunity to understand that as well.
Absolutely, great point, David. And in fact, it's strange in some ways, because if you look at the peak matrix dimensions themselves, and we've made this public, we help providers understand this when they kick off a new peak matrix assessment. We go as far as being explicit that vision and strategy is a key element of the x-axis, which is around vision and capability. So vision and strategy is a key subcomponent of that. And it's a bit like, making sure that while, revenue growth, all of that good stuff gives you a rear view look into the winner, having a forward-looking view is important. And we want to make sure that we explicitly incentivize that. So I think it happens both with incentives and also the way we're organized. But Katrina, I want to make sure that I'm not evading your question. Let's come to common challenges. So we'll talk about a few of the common ones, and it's always fun. It's surprising that being here at Everest Group 9 years now, some of these questions haven't changed. Some of them, keep changing. I've had this recent challenge recently where somebody came up and said, we'd like to think about doing the next briefing for you in the metaverse. Now, that's not something I'd imagined 3 years ago. But anyways, we'll come to that later. So what are the most common challenges? The first one is, if you don't participate in a particular RFI, will Everest Group still feature you in the peak matrix assessment? So the answer, and I'm not trying to be evasive, is it depends. The reason I say it depends is because we want to go back to the roots of the peak matrix. What is the peak matrix fundamentally trying to do? It's trying to be a helpful guide for enterprises who are trying to make sourcing decisions. Nobody makes a sourcing decision by just looking at who's top right in a specific assessment, but it's the start of that sourcing journey. So the call analyst firms take and or our analyst teams will take is whether the provider is relevant to the specific area that the peak matrix is assessing and whether they should be included. Even if the provider doesn't participate, but we feel based on the strength of our own data sets that they should be included, we will. Now, that's not always ideal for the provider because we might take some conservative estimates, but we want to make sure that we are representing the right providers to our end users, sourcing, IT, and other professionals that we work with. So the short answer is even if you want to be excluded in an RFI and the associated peak matrix assessment, the decision might not be as straightforward. It's really the analyst call, and we truly, truly value that integrity and independence.
And it is, sorry, can I just pick up on that point? And I think one of the points to make also is, as you said, is that buyers don't actually just look at who the leaders are and make decisions from there, but actually wherever you are on the peak, actually, most buyers that I've worked with in the past will look at that the whole peak as a way of building your long list. So I think it's like the visibility on the peak is important anyway, because it's actually that's where buyers are starting from. Just to reinforce that point that you made.
Yeah, great point. And in some ways, it's a very nice segue into the second point, which is if somebody participates in a particular RFI, does that necessarily guarantee inclusion? The short answer is no. I think what's often missed is that the peak matrix or any assessment in the market for that matter is fundamentally a shortlisting process as well, right? Because, for any given peak matrix, we're likely talking to 1.5, 2x, sometimes 3x vendors before the final cut makes the list. So for an assessment we did, for example, in decentralized clinical trials last year, I remember we had interest from 50 different vendors, but only 15 made the cut. So, participating does not necessarily mean you will be included, but, we want to be collaborative. So in the early part of the process, the team will give you some sort of an inking, but it's not guaranteed. We want to make sure that we also stay abreast and stay informed for the latest vendors in the landscape to inform our end users better.
And then just on that one.
Jumping on that one, is it also fair to say though, we don't just cast a wide net when we invite companies to participate in the RFI, right? I mean, we've gone through a process of trying to vet them, make sure they're appropriate for the peak. We want to be respectful of what we're asking them to invest in. So how often, validate my assumption or validate my perspective, and how often does that actually happen? That somebody participates in a RFI and then only to find out that they're not on the peak?
Yeah, it's a good question, Katrina. So I think it doesn't happen a lot because we also qualify vendors before we reach out. So we do cast a wider net, but we do some pre-engagement, pre-qualification checks to make sure that the vendors are relevant for that space. And the second thing that happens, and I'd recommend this as a best practice to different providers, is take the opportunity to do pre-engagement with the analyst teams if you're not sure that this is the right peak matrix for you. A lot of people expend a lot of effort in doing the RFI, the whole hog of the peak matrix process, the RFI, the briefings, the customer references, before they fundamentally ask the question of whether this is an area that they're relevant for. So if you're ever in doubt, just ask. A lot of our analyst teams will be very happy to give you that initial perspective, coach you a little bit so that you're only targeting the right peak matrix assessments. And David, you had a point as well.
Well, I was just going to say, I think, Katrina, where in my experience, I think the only time, or predominantly where we see providers who aren't included, is when they've proactively reached out to us and said, well, we know you do a peak, we'd like to be included, but then we've worked it through with them and said, actually, you're not relevant for this particular area, or you're not going to be able to feature. I think the other point I was going to make, though, is that actually a lot of these conversations that we have with providers that may not make that peak, they're still really useful for us and for the service providers, because actually it starts to get us thinking about, are there other peaks that we should be doing that would better serve the audience and the end customers, and maybe those providers are better suited in that particular peak. So those conversations also lead us to continue challenging our own thinking in terms of what peaks do we have and how does that best serve the enterprise audience out there.
Yeah, thank you, David. Actually, that's a really good segue into the best practices. Do you want to, David, take us through a few of the key best practices we've got here?
Yeah, and I think that for me, the main one is probably the top one, which is around really establishing that two-way line of communication. And I think the best peak processes I've seen is where there is someone who's allocated from the service provider side, and they do establish that proactive communication with the person leading the project. We'll always have a designated lead from our side, and it's actually that the AR person and the Everest Group person can really establish that communication And it can be in an informal way and a way that's proactive. So if there's any questions, asking clarifying questions is the next bullet as well. But because those two lines of communication have been opened up, it's actually much easier. It's not like a formal RFP process where you're buying services and it has to be a rigorous, if you ask me a question, I've got to tell everyone else. This is obviously a very different process that we're running here. So having that two-way line of communication as well, I think is really important. And then I think that really just trying to get ahead of the process would be the other point I would make around things such as getting buyer input, reaching out to buyers as soon as you can, so we can actually then, once we've launched it or we're working through the RFI process, you've got your buyers or your buyer references lined up, because that can take a lot of time, and we know service providers often find it difficult to find enough buyer references. So I think launching that program very early as well is also a best practice that we've seen to help smooth the process out.
Katrina, you might
I
be...
got it. I'm sorry. Let me get back on the microphone here. Okay, so what I was saying to myself is we've had some changes, as I said, to the RFI process. So I want to give you a preview of what's happening and what you should expect to see coming down the pipeline. So some exciting things that we've invested in and hopefully will make a difference in your experiences. But we have a research portal that I think you're familiar with. And we've added a live RFI agenda to that page. And so what that means is, whether you are a member or not, it is publicly available for you to go to our website and see the pipeline of RFIs that are forthcoming. You just go to our regular website, everestgroup.com. In the right-hand side, there's a button for Access Reports, and then from there you go to another button that says RFI Agenda. And let me share with you what that looks like. Hopefully you can see this, but it's the RFI Agenda button over here, and you have, this is a screenshot, so I can't scroll through it, but you have the status of the RFI here, the program, the research practice in which it's going to be published, the name of the actual RFI, the anticipated launch date, the anticipated publication date, and whether there's any prior reports on the topic. And if you are a member and have access to those reports, you could click right here and go into the report portal and see the actual study. And if I were to scroll this, you would see that from publication date and RFI launch date, we have dates already for 2023 populating the agenda. And then we have a new feature that says new RFI. And what that means is, as you scroll through this and you see certain RFIs that are highlighted in this lime kind of color, yellow kind of color, you'll know that that's a net new RFI that we're introducing into the market, whereas the others are RFIs that have happened previously. So this is in response to what we've heard from you as well as others in our universe. So this is one thing that we hope will answer a lot of the questions that you might go to your client director for, or reach out to the analysts for.
Katrina, there's been a question from the audience, which is in terms of buyer references and how many are typically required. So I don't know if you have a comment on that, or Nitish wants to give a view.
Sure.
Yeah.
We actually have that among the questions that we didn't get to on the common questions. Nitish, why don't you take a stab at that?
Yep. So let me address that in two ways. So we typically require 3 to 4 buyer references per peak matrix. And the second comment I'll make is, it's usually a mix of, our preferred format is live interviews with clients, just allows us to have a richer discussion, get more context, but we can also accommodate survey-based responses if that's a consideration. So yeah, 3 to 4, and then we have 2 formats in the way we do it.
And they get to designate who gets contacted in which format. Is that correct? Or how does
Absolutely. The provider can choose. And the other best practice I've seen is, if you're participating in a few peak matrix assessments which are interrelated, so say there's a geographical orientation to one or a functional orientation. So CXM, for instance, you're doing North America and EMEA. So you can also look at it as a portfolio, see who can vouch for what. So in case there are similarities, there can be some cross leverage if the topic makes sense.
So the next thing about the RFI change in the RFI process is the RFI communication. And so what we've done is we've consolidated all of the communication to help you orient yourself and launch an RFI into one master email. And there you will have all the links and all the templates to the different components, from the Excel data template to the PowerPoint profile template to the executive briefing guidelines, and then the buyer reference information in one place. So the idea being it to be, one email, you keep it handy and you can go there and see everything and have a good picture of the whole process in one email. And it'll be coming to you from one email address. So you won't be needing to look for different emails from different members of our team. That's on the communication up front. We are also in the process of launching a brand new RFI portal that will happen next month in kind of late July, August timeframe. And what you'll see here is this is more of a workspace. I've said, please bookmark this. It'll become your favorite bookmark. It's an online portal where all of the documents that I just mentioned that you use to respond to an RFI will be visible and manageable in one place. And you can download those documents and upload them, submit them through that site, and keep track of what you've completed and what's outstanding and so forth. So hopefully that increased visibility and consolidation of workspace will help streamline and simplify the work you and your team are doing. And then the third thing is, sorry, David, did you have something?
Katrina, I was just going to say, before you ramp up the excitement even more, I've seen your last bullet which says also exciting, but before you ramp up the excitement even more, there's a couple of questions that maybe we can cover. One was from Sandy, who was asking about the RFI agenda and can we export the RFI agenda? So I don't know if we want to cover that one first, and then I'll ask Nitish one about the coverage areas.
So I have to ask that question of our technical team. I'm not sure, because it is all RFI agendas. I'm not sure which are a lot. I'm not sure if we're making it downloadable or not. I can look into that and get back to you. It's a very good question.
Brilliant. Thanks, Katrina. And then Nitish, the other areas, what areas do we cover? I'm assuming that means what areas do we cover in the RFI process? It may be in terms of which ones we do peak, but did you want to have a stab first?
Yeah, and that's my assumption as well, David. So I think we cover three broad markets. We're not trying to be everything for everyone. So it's IT and IT services. We cover business process services, and we cover engineering services. There's a big taxonomy beneath all of this, but those are really the three markets that we cover, and that's where usually you will find one or the other RFIs are aligned to.
Yeah, and it's very broad, because within each of those three big buckets, you break that down into many, many markets that we follow. So we can follow up with an overview of our coverage as a follow-up to this.
Yeah. And Katrina, I think a data point which might help people is, while we are continually expanding our teams, we don't want to linearly expand the number of peak metrics assessments we do. But to give people a sense, we do anywhere between 70 to 80 peak metrics assessments a year. So that covers all these three markets, and we refresh them every year depending on what's relevant. So that'll give people a sense of the scale.
Yeah, and you know what? We have a link. I don't know if we can put that up in the comments section for everybody, but we do have a quarterly analyst relations newsletter. And many of you are signed up for it, so thank you. But if you're interested in it, please, we'll provide as a follow-up the ability for you to sign up for that. And what it does is once a quarter, we pick a theme. We give you a sense that, what are the recent published research or LinkedIn Lives or webinars in that theme. So we did ESG last quarter. We highlighted our ESG principal analyst, Rita Soni, and we gave you a sense of what our approach is to ESG, as well as covering some of the top research coming out in the past quarter across the firm. Our topic for the coming quarter will be engineering services, and you'll get a taste of what we're doing in that space, as well as the general body of research that we're working on at that time. So, if you sign up for that, that'll give you one way to keep ahead of what's going on with our practice. But the last but most, I think, exciting aspect is that we are putting out an entire client portal, which is its own environment for members to use. So this is different than the research portal. The research portal is where you access content and download reports and share content. The client portal is really very aligned with what I know a lot of analyst relations people do, is that you manage your usage of the membership, you manage the RFI agendas, you manage the research agendas, you manage the keeping track of sort of what kind of usage you've had of the report, how much of your inquiry have you used, how many of the reports, who on your side, who within your organization is using these reports. You want to submit inquiries. All of that, which is sort of the business side, let's say, of your membership management, it will be consolidated in one place. And we'll be sharing a rollout plan with you soon, so you can decide how you want to share that with your internal teams, how you log in, and so forth. We'll be sharing all of that with you. But it's pretty cool. We've done a lot of beta testing. We've gotten some good feedback from some of you, and we think it will also take some time out of your day, or give you time back by requiring less effort on your part, and hopefully streamline and create visibility. So that was the purpose behind that.
Brilliant. Katrina, before we move on, there's been a couple of questions. I'll take the easy one and I'll throw the harder one to
Okay.
The easier one was, is ESG coming up in discussions with buyers? And because I talk to a lot of buyers, then I think I'm okay to answer this one. And the answer is yes. And we definitely know that buyers are looking much more into the aspects of ESG. We're seeing that actually in RFP procurement events, actually ESG elements are actually moving up in terms of having maybe 2 or 3% weighting to 10, 15, even 20% weighting from buyers. So yes, ESG is definitely coming up in discussions with buyers that we're having. The couple of questions I'll throw at Nitish, and they're just combining, which is people are asking the question, can we share the weighting that we give against the RFI and the briefing and the buyer references? And I'm not sure if what your view is on that.
Yep. So David, that's a good question. And I see an associated question on, what is the weighting for just the buyer reference in the peak matrix. Now, we're not new to these questions. If I had, a penny for every time I was asked this question, I wouldn't have to buy all that Bitcoin. But I think the simple answer is each of them don't separately have a weighting. It's really the picture that we're able to draw once we get all of these inputs, because it's not that we're marking you for process on each element, but it's really, are we able to cover the basis of information that are asked in a peak matrix in our assessment model, both on the X and the Y axis? Are we able to cover it with the mix of an RFI, the buyer reference, and the briefing? So it's not that each of them have a specific weighting. And even within the model, while we can't reveal the secret sauce and how each of these factors are weighed, because that often creates different incentives for people to game the system. What I can say quite clearly is, I think the quality and the focus on the briefing, and we provide a specific briefing guide, really helps. And when it comes to customer references and buyer references, if they can truly become your advocates or evangelists, that definitely has a good bearing on your positioning. The RFI helps us get more detailed quantitative information in addition to what we capture. So in some ways, you're trying to capture different things on these different platforms, and it's really our ability to then connect the dots that becomes important for us.
Yeah, we have another question from Marianne, and I believe what she's asking is, can we participate in a peak matrix with just a briefing and customer references, i.e. without the RFI? And traditionally, the answer has been a hard no, but increasingly, we have started including some information in the report, not the peak matrix itself, but in the report about that market, where we highlight other players that compete in the market, maybe provide some commentary and some positioning for them in terms of their strengths and their focus areas, so that they are present in the report and represented in the report, but not on the actual peak matrix itself. Would you, David and Nitish, agree with that? Are you seeing that happening more?
So yes, I would agree directionally, Katrina. I think that's happening. But I think what we've also started realizing maybe in the last 12 months more so is sometimes people are just strapped for resources or the ability to do one of the three things, if not all. So what we started doing is, so technically, Marjan, what you're saying can happen. We have to be a bit conservative if we don't get the RFI. And what we also now started doing, if you look at the fine print, the footnotes on any given peak matrix, if somebody gives partial inputs, which is one of the three things are missing, we often call that out, saying that XYZ service providers gave partial inputs into the peak matrix. So my short recommendation would be to do everything if you can. In case you can't, it's not a deal breaker, but it obviously leads us to being a little more conservative and then calling it out so that we are being transparent to our consumers.
Okay, thank you, Nitish. So, this is sort of the end of the formal part of the presentation. I've come to the end of this few slides that we had. It's open for conversation and questions. I do have the follow-up to do with Sandy to get you the answer about whether we can download the RFI agenda or not. We'll share that with the folks that logged in today. And I'm sort of ready to offer some final words if David and Nitish want to go first.
Yeah, maybe there's just one last question we've not got to actually, if we want to sort of take a little bit of time. So Manish asked another question about in RFIs, we've seen multiple star performers. That does not leave much of a differentiation. I maybe have a different point of view. I mean, I think that we limit the amount of star performers we have. It's not like we make everyone in the peak a star performer. And we do try and differentiate based on those providers that have actually shown sort of the greatest movement, if you like, in their positioning. So I think actually we are trying to differentiate based on where they've started and where they've ended up, and that's why we call them out as a star performer. We don't make everyone a star performer because of that reason for differentiation. But Katrina or Nitish, I don't know if you've got a different viewpoint on that.
Yeah, David, I don't want to sound like an analyst more than I already do, which is it depends. It really depends on the market, right? Because if a market has, what does a star performer really designate? A star performer designates the most significant year-on-year or comparative movement on a peak matrix compared to the previous peak matrix on the same topic. So it does not exist for new peak matrix assessments, but for the repeat or the where we are refreshing. But in some markets, if the pace of change or disruption is high, you will typically see more star performers because that's truly reflective of the market. And that's the reason we don't put a rule of thumb across all of our peak matrix assessments, because we don't want to straitjacket and not recognize the nuances of specific markets. Some markets are just more disruptive, have a higher degree of change velocity, some not so much.
Great, and that's a good point. We try to keep the principles consistent across all of our RFIs. So what the designation of a star performer means the same thing no matter which RFI, and depending on what's happening in that market, the dynamics of that market, you may have a year where you have multiple star performers. You may have in the following year very few star performers because the nature of the market is such that maybe the majority of players had much lower growth and a few of them truly excelled beyond the averages for that market. And they figured out a way to be stars in maybe an otherwise softer market. So with that, I wanted to thank everybody. Hope you have a great afternoon, a great evening. Thank you to my partners, David and Nitish, on joining me for the session today. Do sign up for that Analyst Relations newsletter so you can hear more about more events like this. We will be having more of these kinds of events going forward, looking at different aspects of what matters to Analyst Relations people that work with Everest Group. And so if you have ideas of what you'd like to see discussed another time, feel free to share that. Would love to get that. And have a good afternoon and good evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.